Sir, how much for a mommy that doesn't leave, please? I have $18.75. Is it enough for a mommy who does not leave? Those were the first words to break the quiet air of the Cardier Kids store on Fifth Avenue, spoken just as Benjamin Clay lifted his head from the glass display counter he had been polishing. A pair of trembling little hands placed the crumpled foil-wrapped coins on the counter, as though the girl had been clutching them for days, holding on to the last fragile hope she had. And there she stood, beneath the soft golden glow of the chandelier that reflected against the polished oak floor. A girl of about 8 years old with mud-stained sneakers, a worn coat with frayed shoulders, and a head of tangled brown curls tousled by the winter wind. She was not a customer, not a prank, and certainly not a sight anyone in that elegant place had ever expected. Just a homeless child standing still, looking straight at Benjamin, with eyes far too serious for her age, eyes that froze the air around them. He had heard her clearly, but his heart resisted the meaning. He leaned in closer, wondering if he had misheard her over the soft carols playing in the background. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and strained with surprise. The girl repeated herself slowly, calmly, like someone who had rehearsed the words many times. "I want to buy a mother. A real one, not a doll, not a toy, one who stays." People nearby turned their heads. A few frowned in discomfort. Some pulled their children closer as if poverty could pass between them like a sickness. A woman wearing layers of jewelry whispered to her husband, "Good heavens, who lets this kind of thing happen on Fifth Avenue?" A young clerk at the neighboring counter looked toward Benjamin, uncertain whether to call security. But Benjamin did not move. He could not look away. Could not convince himself this was simply a lost child. There was something in that voice, in those carefully measured words, that cracked something deep within him. The girl swallowed gently, then continued, "My name is Zoey. I know this store sells expensive things, but I thought maybe you sell important things too, or know where I could find one." The shop, once bright with the festive colors of handcrafted toys, now felt suddenly cold. Benjamin, a 46-year-old man who had built the most luxurious toy store chain in New York, who had signed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars with steady hands, now found himself speechless before an 8-year-old child. He forced his voice into a gentle tone. "We don't sell mothers here, sweetheart." Zoey nodded as though she had expected that answer. "I know. I asked at 6 other stores already, but rich people usually have more than other people. I thought maybe they might have an extra mom or know where to get one." That sentence made a few customers shake their heads and walk away, thinking the situation was an inconvenience. But Zoey didn't care. She placed her hand on the money again, as though presenting evidence in a grown-up negotiation. "I'm not begging. I'm offering to pay. Buying means they have to stay." Benjamin drew a slow breath. His chest tightened. "There are no mothers to buy," he said softly. "Then where is your mother?" Zoey looked down at her wet shoes. "I don't know. She said if anything happened, I had to be brave. She said she would come back to the bus station, but it's been 2 nights already." Outside the window, the wind howled against the glass, sweeping snow into the doorway. Benjamin could hear his own heartbeat, loud and strangely insistent. He did not understand why the words of this unknown child reached so deeply into him. Perhaps it was because he saw a glimpse of his own past. A boy who once stood in an empty house, unable to understand why the foster mother he loved never returned. Zoey slowly pulled the money back, tucking it into her coat pocket as if she were putting away her final shred of hope. "I'm sorry to bother you. I thought this place might help." Then she turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the snow was falling thick and white, and a New York winter does not show mercy to a child so small. Benjamin watched her go, the sense that something precious was slipping from his grasp washing over him. And in that single moment, he knew with the quiet certainty that changes lives that his world was about to shift in a way he had never imagined. If you're still listening to this story, perhaps your heart too just stirred like Benjamin's in that fateful moment. Before we continue with what happens next, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Leave us a small comment with the name of your city or country, so we can see just how far this story has traveled across the map, and if you believe this story is one worth sharing. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with those you care about. Emotional Echoes is here to bring you deeply moving, meaningful stories filled with humanity and heart every single day. Now let's continue the journey of Benjamin and Zoey in the next chapter. Benjamin could not quite remember how he had stepped out from behind the counter. All he knew was that his legs were carrying him after the small figure who had just left the store. Outside, the snow had fallen thick in soft white layers, and the wind sliced down the avenue with such icy sharpness that no one wanted to linger in the streets. But Zoey did not stop. She walked along the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue as if she had long since grown used to the cold, used to having no one call her name and used to moving forward even when hope had run dry. Benjamin called out, "Zoey." She did not turn, but he did not stop. When he caught up to her, she was curled beneath the awning of a closed bakery, arms folded across her chest, shoulders trembling beneath a thin silver-gray coat frayed at the cuffs. He stood before her breathless from running and still unsure why his heart ached so sharply for a child he had known for less than 10 minutes. Zoey looked up at him, and the look in her eyes silenced him. It was not the gaze of a child seeking pity. It was the gaze of someone who had seen too much, understood too early, and learned not to expect anything from anyone. Benjamin pulled off the scarf around his neck and gently laid it over her shoulders. It was thick cashmere ash gray, soft and warm, carrying the faint scent of peppermint from the high-end laundry soap. Zoey said nothing. She sat down on the cold stone step, gripping the edge of the scarf like something precious she did not dare believe was real. Benjamin lowered himself beside her, though the wind scraped cold against his face. He asked quietly, "What's your mother's name?" Zoey answered, "Her name is Lauren. She worked at a hotel not far from the bus station, but a few days ago she started coughing a lot. Her face looked pale, and one night she told me not to go anywhere. She said she would be back soon, but she never came back." Zoey had waited the whole night, then the next, at the same spot, but no one asked, no one noticed. She recited it all without blinking, her voice steady like someone reciting a memorized lesson because it was the only way to keep her mother alive in her memory. As Benjamin listened, a strange pain began to rise in his chest. An 8-year-old child with no father, no family, and no home, and yet she had held on to such quiet strength. He asked gently, "Have you eaten?" Zoey shook her head. The past few days only leftover breadcrumbs. But this morning there wasn't even that. Benjamin gave a slow nod. He didn't know what words could ease the weight of such hunger, but he knew one thing with certainty. No one should be on the streets in this kind of cold. Least of all, a child with mud-covered shoes and a coat that could not keep out the wind. He stood up and held out his hand. "Come with me. We need to find somewhere warmer." Zoey looked up at him, didn't move toward him, but didn't step away either. Her eyes studied him as if trying to decide whether this was a grown-up she could trust. After a few seconds, she rose to her feet. She didn't take his hand, but she walked beside him, close enough to hear him breathe, yet far enough to run if she needed to. On the way to the Liberty Diner just down the block, they didn't speak much. Benjamin let her set the pace, never rushing her, never pulling. He understood that to earn the trust of a child like Zoey, words weren't what mattered. Time was. And as the snow continued to fall, painting the sidewalks in winter's hush, Benjamin knew that this meeting was no longer just chance. It was the moment when a man who thought he had everything realized he had been missing the one thing that mattered most. And a little girl, who believed she had nothing at all, turned out to be the one to give back what he had lost long ago. A reason to care. A reason to stay. The glass door of Liberty Diner gave a soft chime as Benjamin pushed it open, letting a wave of warmth spill out to meet them, carrying with it the comforting aroma of hot soup-buttered pies and freshly brewed coffee. Zoey paused at the threshold, her soaked shoes hesitating on the worn tile floor. Inside, the diner glowed with a soft golden light, the quiet clink of silverware on ceramic and the low hum of jazz drifting from a radio behind the counter created an unfamiliar peace, as though this place existed in a pocket of calm, untouched by the cold and harshness waiting just beyond the door. Benjamin gave her a slight nod, signaling her to go ahead. Zoey stepped in slowly, her eyes glancing at the diners before choosing the outermost edge of a booth near the wall, as though unsure if she truly belonged here. A woman of late years, her silver hair neatly tied back and a striped apron fastened around her waist, approached them with a gentle smile. Her name tag read, Ruby. She looked at Zoey, then at Benjamin. "Sweet girl you've got there, sir." Your niece Benjamin simply smiled without offering a clear answer. Ruby didn't press. She handed them 2 menus and asked in a warm voice, "What can I get you two tonight?" Zoey looked up, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you have anything warm?" Ruby leaned in closer and said, "Everything here is warm, sweetheart, but I think you'll like the chicken soup with garlic bread." Zoey nodded, but when Ruby turned away, she leaned toward Benjamin and murmured, "I just want one thing. I have $18.75. If I eat too much, I won't have enough left to buy my mom." Benjamin paused. Her words slipped past his coat and into his chest like a quiet blade. He looked at Zoey, unsure how to answer in a way that could do justice to the weight behind her voice. She wasn't asking for more. She was simply trying to protect the one thing she still controlled. "Don't worry, you're my guest," he said softly. Zoey frowned. "But that means I owe you. And I don't want to owe anyone. Owing means you have to leave if they don't want you around." Benjamin didn't answer right away. He just looked at her the way she clutched the edge of his scarf, those wide eyes scanning the room with quiet caution. "No 8-year-old should understand debt like that. No child should weigh their existence against what they cost. You don't owe me anything," he said, finally, his voice low and firm. "In here, you don't have to pay. You just sit and get warm." Zoey didn't respond, but her shoulders eased just slightly. When the soup arrived, steaming and fragrant, she cupped the bowl in both small hands, as if afraid the warmth might vanish if she didn't hold on to it. She tasted the first spoonful slowly, cautiously. Then, almost unconsciously, she closed her eyes, breathed in the scent, and let out a long breath. It wasn't the sigh of someone tasting something delicious. It was the breath of someone who, for the first time in a very long time, felt safe. Behind the counter, Ruby watched in silence. She had seen all kinds of people pass through that diner over the past 30 years, but few times had she seen a child eat a simple bowl of soup as if it were a small miracle. And for the first time in many years, Benjamin felt no pressure from time. He didn't check his phone. He didn't think about tomorrow's meetings. He didn't worry about the toy stores he owned or the woman who called him every evening without fail. He just sat there watching a child quietly absorb the warmth of her first real moment of comfort in what must have been a long winter of silence. And he wondered how in all these years he had let his heart grow so cold in a world so full of comfort. He wondered why it had taken this long for him to feel something as fragile and real as what was beginning to rise within him now. A feeling so gentle, yet so true, that he sensed perhaps for the first time he was finally returning to himself. By the time they left Liberty Diner, the wind had grown stronger, and the snow was falling heavier than when they'd entered. The flakes no longer drifted like feathers. They struck the skin at an angle, sharp and cold like needles. Benjamin wrapped Zoe's scarf tighter, trying to shield her neck and ears, but he knew it wasn't enough. She was too small, too thin, and her worn coat couldn't hold back the cold that had blanketed the city. They walked quickly along a street near Central Park, the lamplight catching in the slick pavement, turning it into an endless sheet of mirrored glass. Zoey said nothing. She didn't ask where they were going or why. She simply walked beside Benjamin, silent, her wet shoes squishing against the ground with each step. When they stopped in front of the building where Benjamin lived, Zoey looked up, her eyes full of disbelief, as if unsure someone like her would be allowed into a place that tall. The glass doors slid open, and the doorman greeted Benjamin by name. Zoey moved closer to him as they passed through the marble-floored lobby. His apartment was on the 23rd floor. When the elevator doors opened, Zoey didn't step in right away. She turned to him and whispered, almost like asking for permission. "I'm not bothering you, am I?" Benjamin bent down and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. No one is ever a bother when they just need a warm place to be. The apartment opened with soft light, refined furnishings, gleaming walnut floors, and tall windows that overlooked a city blanketed in snow. Zoey stood at the edge of the doorway, not daring to step too far, and Benjamin took off his coat and hung it on the rack. When he turned, he saw her still standing there, eyes scanning the room with a wariness that seemed always present. His voice was quiet. "You can come in. This is my home, and tonight it's yours too." She nodded slightly, then stepped inside with small, careful steps. She slipped off her wet shoes at the edge of the rug and stood still, as if afraid of dirtying the floor. Benjamin handed her a large bath towel. "Go take a warm shower and change into one of my sleep shirts. It'll be a little big, but it's clean and dry. Bathroom's on the left." Zoey took the towel, gave a soft nod, and disappeared behind the closing door. Benjamin stood in the living room watching the city lights reflect off the windows, his heart tangled in emotions he could not name. He didn't know why he had brought a stranger's child into his home. It wasn't duty. It wasn't pity. It was something in her eyes, something that made it impossible to turn away. When Zoey emerged, her hair lightly towel-dried and her small frame wrapped in an oversized t-shirt that hung nearly to her knees, he had already set out a cup of hot chocolate and a thick blanket on the sofa. She sat down holding the cup in both hands. She didn't drink right away. She simply held it close, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Benjamin sat at a respectful distance. He didn't press her to talk. He simply turned on the television, the volume low, playing an old animated film. And for the first time, the apartment, usually so quiet and cold, seemed to carry the rhythm of life. It wasn't noise. It wasn't movement. It was just the presence of another breath that wasn't his own. Zoey set the cup down, pulled the blanket closer, and after a moment she asked softly, "Do you live alone?" Benjamin looked over at her. "Yes. For a long time." She nodded as if that answer told her everything she needed to know. "Me too, at the bus station. But I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't bother anyone, then maybe they wouldn't make me leave." Benjamin had no reply. Her words were too true, so true that he realized he had lived that same way once, though in a different form. She leaned back against the pillow, eyes closing slowly. He gently pulled the blanket over her, careful not to wake her. And as the city lights spilled across the ceiling, Benjamin sat there in silence, listening to the steady breathing of a child who had grown used to never being asked to stay. And for the first time in many years, he wished the night would not pass too quickly. Because in the bitter winter of New York, he realized the coldest thing was not the wind or the snow. It was the ache of living a life where no one needed you. And now it was this small, lost child who was quietly rekindling a warmth in him he thought had gone out long ago. Morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains, spreading a gentle golden hue across the floor. Benjamin woke earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or the pull of work, but because something in the air felt different, as if the world had shifted slightly overnight. The apartment was quiet, but it was no longer the empty silence he had grown used to. This quiet held a tenderness to it, a softness, as if someone's breath was gently woven through the once cold walls. He stepped out of his bedroom, bare feet brushing the cool walnut floor, and stopped at a sight he never thought he'd witness inside his own home. Zoey was standing in front of the refrigerator, hands clasped behind her back, wide eyes fixed on the softly glowing light spilling from the door she'd left slightly ajar. She stood there a long while, touching nothing, and simply watching the pale interior light as if it opened into another world. When she sensed someone approaching, she turned quickly, hands snapping to her sides as if she'd been caught. "I'm sorry. I wasn't taking anything," she said. Benjamin raised a hand gently. "It's all right. What were you doing?" She was quiet for a few seconds before answering softly. "The light in there is really pretty, and everything looks real, like in a drawing." Her words startled him. A grown-up would see a refrigerator as nothing more than an appliance, but a child who'd lived on the streets saw it as a kind of wonder. He opened the door wider, took out a carton of milk, then turned and asked, "What do you like to eat for breakfast?" Zoey hesitated. "I don't know. I've never had breakfast at someone's house before." That simple sentence caught in Benjamin's throat. He carefully pulled out eggs, bread, butter, and a few slices of ham and began preparing breakfast. Zoey silently pulled out a chair and sat at the very edge of the dining table, her eyes following his every movement like she was watching something sacred unfold. She didn't touch the tablecloth, didn't lean into the chair, just sat there quietly, her feet swinging just above the floor. When he placed the plate in front of her, eggs soft and steaming beside toast, browned with butter, Zoey stared at it for a long moment, almost afraid that touching it would make it disappear. "Can I eat it?" she asked, and in that question lay a reflection of everything she had ever endured. Benjamin pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Everything here is for you," he said. "There's nothing you're not allowed to have." Zoey nodded and picked up her fork, eating slowly, taking small bites as though she was learning how to believe she deserved to be there. Benjamin didn't say more. He simply sat across from her, sharing the space, sharing what might seem like an ordinary breakfast, but was in truth the first time in years he had not eaten alone. After the last bite, Zoey reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She laid it carefully on the table, It was the back of a grocery receipt, and on it, drawn in blue ballpoint pen, was a simple picture of a house with wide windows and a tall tree. Underneath the tree stood a grown-up and a child. She said, "I draw the places I wish I could go. But now I think I want to draw the place where I had breakfast." Benjamin stood without a word, stepping toward the tall window where the morning light spilled in like honey. He turned back toward her. "I have a little table I haven't used. If you want, we can set it right here. Make it your drawing spot." Zoe's eyes lit up, though she didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked quietly, "How long can I sit there?" Benjamin smiled, his voice gentle, "As long as you need." She didn't reply with words, but she nodded slowly, as if holding herself back from hoping too much. And Benjamin understood. What Zoey needed wasn't just shelter or a warm meal. What she needed was permission to exist without having to ask for it. And that morning in a sunlit kitchen, he began to learn how to become someone a child might one day call home. Candace Monroe arrived without warning. She always did. It was her nature to step into any space without knocking, as if the world itself was always prepared for her entrance. When the doorman called upstairs to say she was already in the elevator, Benjamin exhaled quietly. He hadn't told her about Zoey, not because he meant to keep it secret, but because he hadn't yet figured out how. Part of him wasn't sure Candace would understand. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. Candace stepped out in a pristine white dress, heels tapping sharply against the floor, a designer bag on her arm, and makeup so flawless it looked airbrushed. "I thought you were busy till tonight," she said, walking into the apartment like it was a curated showroom meant to reflect her brand. Benjamin didn't answer right away. He stood slowly from his chair. Candace glanced around, eyes quickly catching the empty mug of hot chocolate and the small scarf draped over the sofa. "What's this? You have company?" At that moment, Zoey appeared from the hallway, a new drawing in her hand, eyes bright with quiet excitement. But the moment she saw the stranger standing in the middle of the room, her smile vanished. She froze as if she'd done something wrong. Candace stared. "Who is this?" Benjamin stepped forward, his voice calm. "This is Zoey. She needed a safe place to stay." "It's a little complicated. I was going to explain." Candace let out a sharp, humorless laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "A homeless child, here in this apartment. Are you serious?" Benjamin kept his voice steady. "She doesn't have anyone. Her mother is missing. I just wanted to help." Candace folded her arms, her gaze turning cold. "And helping means bringing a liability into your home. Do you realize what this could do to your image if it gets out? I've been planning your charity event for next week. If people find out you're living with an undocumented child, no legal guardianship, no paperwork, I won't be able to control the fallout." Zoey took a step back, her eyes falling, the drawing slipping in her hand like it might fall to the floor. But she didn't cry. She just stood there, retreating into herself like a stray cat used to being cornered. Benjamin saw it. And what hurt most was that Zoey didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had grown used to being seen as a problem. "You're talking about a child, not a publicity campaign." Benjamin said, his voice lower now, but sharper. "You're talking about reputation. I'm talking about a life." Candace narrowed her eyes. "I'm talking about reality, about responsibility, about everything you could lose because of an emotional impulse." Benjamin stared at her for a long moment, then slowly turned to Zoey. He stepped forward, kneeling to her eye level. "Are you all right, Zoey?" She gave the faintest nod, her voice barely audible. "I'm okay. I'll go if I need to. I don't want to cause trouble." Candace laughed again. "See, even she knows this is a mistake." But that was the moment Benjamin stood. He spoke slowly, each word striking the air like the chime of a slow, deliberate bell. "She's not the one causing trouble, Candace. You are. Because you're looking at a child and seeing a liability. You're looking at someone who needs help and seeing a threat. You see the world through branding. I'm seeing a person who needs me to stay." Silence filled the room. Candace gripped her handbag tighter, lips pressed into a firm line. "If you're choosing her, don't expect me to stay." Benjamin nodded. "I'm not asking you to." Candace turned sharply and walked out, her heels echoing cold and sharp across the hardwood floor. The door closed behind her, and the apartment fell into quiet once more. Zoey was still standing, the drawing still in her hand now, slightly crumpled at the corner. Benjamin stepped over gently and took the paper. This time there were no trees, no sunlight, just two figures, one tall and one small, standing in the center of a room with large windows. She whispered, "I thought she was going to yell, but she didn't. She just didn't like me." Benjamin sat beside her. "Sometimes silence is a kind of rejection too, but not everyone is like that. I'm not like that." Zoey looked up at him. Her eyes no longer held panic, only the familiar caution of someone who has learned never to expect too much. She didn't ask if she had to leave. She had already lived too long in a world where people always left. But Benjamin didn't leave. He sat beside her, steady and quiet, as if waiting for something to return. And maybe, just maybe, that something was trust. That night the apartment was wrapped in a strange kind of quiet. There were no sharp echoes of high heels, no reminders of image or high-profile events. Only the soft glow of a table lamp remained, casting gentle light across the room, accompanied by the steady ticking of the wall clock like a quiet heartbeat. Zoey was curled beneath the thick blanket lying on her side on the sofa, eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling as if trying to keep her mind from wandering to a place colder than the walls outside. Benjamin sat not far from her, a book open in his hands, though he hadn't read a single word. The image of Candace walking out still lingered, but what stayed with him more deeply was the look in Zoe's eyes when she said she would leave if needed. A child should not be familiar with leaving. A child should not think of herself as a burden. He watched her for a long time, then stood and walked over. "Would you rather sleep in a real bed? It's softer in there." Zoey shook her head. "It's light out here. I don't like the dark." He nodded. "Then you can stay right here, as long as you like." Zoey was quiet. Then after a while her voice floated up, barely louder than a breath. "Was she your wife?" Benjamin shook his head. "No, she was a girlfriend. She used to be." Zoey nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. She turned away, tucking her face into the pillow. He thought she had fallen asleep, so he quietly returned to his desk. But only a few minutes passed before he heard a small voice, so faint it seemed to drift through the room like a breeze against the wall. "Daddy Ben." He froze. He wasn't sure he'd heard it right. He turned, saw Zoey still lying there, eyes closed, arms around her pillow. Maybe she was dreaming. Maybe it had come from somewhere inside her sleep. But the words had been clear, real. Not Uncle Ben, not Mister, but Daddy Ben. Two simple words, soft as breath, yet powerful enough to stop him where he stood. He had been called many things in his life. Founder, CEO, visionary, even perfect partner once or twice, but never father. And now this child, no blood, no bond, no obligation, had said it as if it had never been a question. Not because he was perfect, but because he had stayed. Benjamin stepped forward and sat gently at the edge of the sofa. Zoe's eyes were still closed, but her small shoulders trembled slightly. Not from cold, but from something deeper, something rising quietly inside her like an invisible tide. He didn't say a word. He simply rested his hand on the edge of the blanket, a quiet promise of presence. Then he sat there, his hand still, his eyes never leaving the small face, slowly drifting toward sleep. In that quiet room, Benjamin no longer felt like the man who had moved through glittering parties and tense boardrooms, who had built an empire on polished smiles and empty praise. He was just a man who had been chosen to stay in the life of a child no one else had stayed for. And that night, for the first time in a long time, there was no hollow space inside his chest, only something soft and steady and warm beginning to bloom, like a tiny hand had placed its trust in him with two fragile words, words gentle enough to shatter everything he thought he knew and strong enough to make him whole. The next morning unfolded with a quiet, almost tender stillness. Zoey was the first to wake, still curled in the thick blanket, her hair gently tousled from deep sleep. She sat up, rubbed her eyes, then silently made her way to the small drawing table by the window, where early sunlight poured in, catching the dust in the air like flecks of gold. Benjamin had told her she could use any of the paper or pencils on the desk, and after a moment's hesitation she began sketching the apartment in her own way. She drew the glowing refrigerator, the sofa with its soft woolen throw, the breakfast table, and a man pouring milk. The lines were still unsteady, but every stroke carried something unspoken, like she was trying to keep every detail of this gentle, impermanent world she'd just stepped into. In the kitchen, Benjamin was making breakfast, warming milk and slicing toast into small pieces. He felt something inside himself changing day by day. Slowly, yes, but deeply. He no longer rushed to check emails first thing in the morning. He no longer cared if a meeting started late. When Zoey sat down to eat, she whispered quietly, almost as if afraid to disturb the air. "Last night I called you something. I'm sorry if I wasn't supposed to." Benjamin looked at her, and a slow, quiet smile appeared on his face. "That was the most beautiful thing anyone's ever called me." Zoey gave a small laugh, light and unforced, the first smile in days that hadn't felt like effort. But peace, as it often does, proved fragile. Just before noon, the doorbell rang, a long, sharp chime, firmer than usual. Benjamin rose, uncertain who would come at this hour. When he opened the door, two people stood outside. One was a woman in a long coat, a city ID clipped to her collar, a thick folder in her hands. Beside her was a young man in a suit, his expression courteous but resolute. The woman stepped forward, her tone polite but clear. "Good morning. I'm Sarah Blake with the city's Child Protective Services. We received an anonymous report that a minor may be residing here outside of legal procedure. We need to speak with you." Benjamin froze. A cold current ran down his spine. Anonymous report. Candace. He didn't need to ask, he already knew. He stepped aside and let them in. Zoey, who had been quietly drawing, paused the moment she heard unfamiliar voices. She set down her pencil, her fingers brushing the corner of the page, and looked toward the two strangers entering the room. Her body tense, her eyes already preparing for what she thought was coming, another place to leave. Sarah walked gently to her, crouching down to eye level. "Hi there, you must be Zoey. My name is Sarah. I'd just like to talk for a minute, okay? Nobody here is going to hurt you." Zoey nodded but said nothing. Benjamin sat nearby, watching her without blinking. The man took out paperwork and began questioning Benjamin how Zoey came to be here, whether he had the consent of a legal guardian, if there were any medical records or legal documents filed. Benjamin answered honestly and briefly. "No, I don't have any of that. She came alone. No family. Her mother disappeared. I just gave her a place to stay so she wouldn't have to sleep outside." Sarah turned to Zoey. "Do you remember your mom's name? Do you know where she might be?" Zoey replied in a soft voice. "Her name is Lauren. I waited for her at the bus station, but she never came back. I don't know if she's still alive or—" Her voice broke and she looked down. Benjamin moved closer and sat beside her. "You're not alone anymore. I'm right here." But Sarah gently rested her hand on the folder in her lap. "I'm sorry. According to city policy, we're required to take her to a licensed temporary shelter while we conduct our investigation. It's just protocol." Zoey looked at Benjamin, then turned to Sarah. "I was there before. The people there don't look at you. It's colder than outside. I've only just been warm for a few days. Please don't make me leave." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She wasn't heartless, but she was bound by the law. Benjamin stood. "Then I want to apply for temporary guardianship or foster placement. Whatever the process is, I'll do it. I'll sign whatever's needed." The young man shook his head. "That takes time. There's a process. For now, the child has to come with us." Zoey stood, hands clutching the hem of her shirt. She walked toward Benjamin and asked softly, "Will you come with me?" He bent down, placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "I'll go anywhere for you, I promise." When Sarah extended her hand to guide Zoey, the girl turned back one last time, eyes full of fear. But this time she didn't cry. She only whispered just loud enough for Benjamin to hear, "If I wait, will you come back?" Benjamin nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "No matter how long you wait, I will come back." And then the door closed behind them. Once again, Benjamin was alone. But this time the silence wasn't the cold silence of loneliness. It was the silence of a man who was about to fight for the most important thing he had ever been given, a promise, to a child waiting in a city that had never learned how to be kind. The moment the door closed behind Zoey, leaving the apartment hollow in her wake, Benjamin felt as though he had lost something larger than himself. He stood motionless in the living room for a long time, where the half-empty cup of warm milk she had left behind still sat quietly cooling. Everything around him remained just as it had been: her unfinished sketches on the desk, the corner where she used to curl up beneath a blanket, and the small dining chair he had pulled beside his own each morning. But now those details felt painfully still, as if the life they once carried had been drained out, leaving only their shape behind. That night, Benjamin could not sleep. He paced through the apartment, from the window to the hallway, then back to the desk, where he sat staring at his unopened laptop. Every sentence Zoey had ever said seemed to echo around him like pieces of a fading dream. But one in particular played on repeat. "If I wait, will you come back?" It wasn't just a child's fear. It was a cry for rescue, and Benjamin knew with every part of himself that he could not break that promise. The next morning, he called Marcus Halloway, his longtime attorney, and the man who had guided him through some of the most complex business negotiations of his career. Marcus was sharp, deliberate, and more than anything, a father himself. When Benjamin explained simply that he wanted to fight for custody of a child he had known for only a few days, there was silence on the line at first. Then a calm response. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." So Benjamin did. He told him about that afternoon in the toy store, about the dinner at Liberty Diner, about the quiet nights, the whispered trust, the broken look in Zoe's eyes, and the moment she called him something he never thought he'd hear. "I just want a mother who doesn't leave." Marcus listened, interrupting only now and then for clarity. When Benjamin finished, Marcus let out a long breath. "This won't be easy," he said. "There's an anonymous complaint. The girl has no identification, no listed guardian, and right now you have no legal standing, but I understand why you're doing this, and I'll help you." That afternoon, they sat together in a quiet office overlooking Midtown. A fresh stack of legal forms sat between them, blank for now, but soon to be filled with documents, evidence testimonies, medical records, a petition for custody, and pages proving both financial stability and emotional preparedness. Benjamin signed each one with steady hands, every signature a vow. He knew the law didn't take emotion as proof. It required process. It required structure. And he would give it that every step, every line, every form if it meant Zoey could come home. Marcus explained they'd need a psychological evaluation statements from people who had seen Benjamin and Zoey together. Employees from the store, a waitress at the diner, anyone who could speak to how she responded in his care. Benjamin nodded. "I'll find them." Marcus added a quiet warning: stay away from the press, keep emotion out of public sight, and most of all, be patient. Benjamin left the office in the fading light of late afternoon. Outside, the wind had picked up cold and dry, but inside him something unfamiliar had taken root. It wasn't just hope, it was determination. He had never fought for anyone but himself. He had never risked his heart without some guarantee of safety. But Zoey wasn't just a child he had met by chance. She was a mirror held up to the forgotten corners of his own life. She was his ache, his childhood without comfort, his silent waiting without answer. That night he returned to the apartment and for the first time in years pulled out an old box hidden deep in his bookshelf. Inside were faded childhood photos, a few worn toys, and a small card he had written to his father but never sent. The handwriting was jagged, a child's attempt at clarity. Just one line: "Dad, I'm still waiting." He folded the card and placed it beside the newly printed adoption forms. His heart had once known how to wait, and now it was his turn to be the one who came back not just for a promise, but because there was no other way to live a life that meant something. Because sometimes real love doesn't come from blood. It comes from the decision to stay, even when everything must begin again from nothing. 3 days after Benjamin began his legal journey to win custody of Zoey, a small envelope appeared at his doorstep. No name, no return address. The doorman mentioned a middle-aged woman in a dark blue coat had dropped it off early that morning. As Benjamin held it in his hand, it felt as if he were holding the weight of an entire world. He opened it slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter something irreplaceable. Inside was a folded sheet of paper tucked inside a simple handmade card. The letter was brief, just a few lines written in a shaky childlike scrawl. The blue ink was slightly smudged, perhaps written in haste, or perhaps by fingers trembling from the cold. At the top it read, "To Daddy Ben. I'm trying to be brave like Mommy said, but this place doesn't feel like home. They gave me clean clothes, but I don't feel clean. They gave me food, but I don't feel full. I don't need a new house. I just need the place where you let me draw by the window. If you come back, I'll be waiting. Love, little bird." At the bottom was a tiny pencil drawing of a bird, its head tilted up looking at the sky. Benjamin didn't read the letter a second time. He folded it gently, pressed it to his chest, and closed his eyes. His heart no longer beat calmly. It raced urgent and unrelenting, as if it too was afraid of being left behind. In the silence of the apartment, he could hear his own heartbeat like a drum. He walked quietly to Zoey's room. The room still held the shape of her presence. The air still soft, as if her breath hadn't fully left. On the small bookshelf, her tin box sat where she had left it on the first night. Benjamin had never opened it, respecting even the smallest corners of her privacy. But now he needed to know. He needed to see her world from the inside to understand what he was fighting for. The lid gave a soft click as it opened. Inside were 3 things. A small Polaroid photo of a woman smiling behind a hotel front desk. A plastic bracelet missing half its beads, the last one barely holding the letter Z, scratched unevenly into it. And a worn piece of paper, its bold print faded with time. "Be brave, little bird." Benjamin touched each object with reverent care, as though they were made of glass. He pictured a child holding that box each night, clinging to its contents like a raft in dark water. To anyone else, they might seem like nothing. But to Zoey, they were everything. A mother's tired but tender smile. a broken gift still carrying her name, and a final message that read like a will made of hope. He closed the lid and held the box tightly in both hands as if making a silent vow. Then he called Marcus. "I got a letter," he said quietly, "from her." There was a long pause on the line. Then Marcus asked, his voice soft, "What did she say?" Benjamin stood by the window, eyes on the horizon. "She said she'll wait." Marcus understood immediately. He promised to escalate the process, to file supplemental materials to add emotional evidence to the case. They would draft a new appeal, submit Zoey's letter to the review board, but Benjamin knew he had something else to do. That afternoon, he returned to Cardier Kids, the toy store where everything had begun. He placed the tin box carefully on the display counter, right in the center of a row of gleaming high-end toys. Beside it, he added a handwritten sign in thick black ink. "These are the most important things in a child's life, and not one of them can be bought." Employees and shoppers paused. Some read the note and wiped their eyes. Others stood still, quietly shaken. No one left untouched. That night, Benjamin sat by the window. The letter spread before him, the tin box beside it, and a fresh copy of the adoption papers resting close by. The apartment felt still, but not with emptiness. It felt like something sacred was now present, filling the air with quiet gravity. He realized then that the courts might require signatures. The process might need forms, timelines, evaluations. But none of it spoke more clearly than a child's letter and a handful of keepsakes. These were the true documents, not filed, not notarized, but lived. Because real love doesn't need many words. Just 3 small items and a promise to come back. And Benjamin would come back, no matter how far he had to go. The next morning, just as Benjamin stepped out of the law office with Marcus, his phone began to vibrate without pause. Messages, calls, and notifications flooded his screen like a sudden storm. He frowned, unsure what had happened, when Marcus's assistant called with urgency. Marcus answered, listened silently for a few moments, then handed the phone to Benjamin with a look that said more than words could. "You need to see this." On the screen played a vertical video, shaky handheld, but with a voice that rang steady and clear. The woman in the frame was Ruby, the longtime waitress from Liberty Diner, still in her apron, a stain of soup near the hem. She stood behind the counter looking directly into the camera. No script, no performance, just truth. "I've worked at this diner almost 30 years, she began. "I've served everyone, homeless folks, lawyers, cab drivers, business people. But that night when I saw that little girl come in with Mr. Benjamin soaked from head to toe, shivering, and with eyes that didn't belong to a child, I knew something wasn't right." She paused, choosing her words. Her voice trembled slightly. "She didn't ask for food. She didn't cry. She just asked if we had something warm. And when I brought her a bowl of soup, she held it like it was the only thing keeping her alive. And him, Mr. Benjamin, he didn't look at her like she was a problem. He bent down, listened to her, wrapped his own scarf around her wet hair. I didn't know who he was then. I just knew I was witnessing something sacred." Her eyes glistened. "When CPS took Zoey away, I stood there and watched them go. And I cried. I'm speaking now because I can't stay quiet while a man like him is questioned just for doing what's right. He didn't rescue a lost child. He's protecting a soul that was falling apart." The video ended with Ruby resting her hand on a paper doll Zoey had drawn and given her. Within hours, the video had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. The comments poured in at dizzying speed. A mother wrote that she had adopted a child and knew what it meant to fight an entire system just to keep hold of a child who needed her. An elderly man shared that he'd once been left at a bus terminal at age 8 and prayed someone like Benjamin had walked by. Outside Cartier, kids people began to gather, first a handful, then dozens, then more. They stood silently, some holding handmade signs. "Let Zoey come home." A child is not a legal file. Love doesn't need paperwork. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, held a sign high above her head. "She's not PR, she's a heart." Ruby stood in the crowd too, apron still on, the lines of her face set with quiet strength. When Benjamin arrived, he didn't walk past them as a man of stature. He stopped. His eyes glistened and he bowed his head slightly, a hand pressed to his chest in a gesture of gratitude, not for their noise, but for their hearts, for their presence, for seeing what mattered. Marcus stood beside him, speaking low. "They don't know the law, but they know the heart. That video, this crowd, it wasn't part of the legal strategy, but it's more powerful than any argument I could write. It speaks from where no law can reach." Benjamin understood. In that moment, it became clear sometimes it's the strangers who become family, not because they have to, but because they choose to. And that kind of love doesn't need a court ruling. It only needs someone to stand and say, she matters, and someone else to answer, we see her, and all of them together to believe she belongs. Benjamin sat alone in his office on the top floor of the Cartier building, silently watching the city glow with year-end lights through the glass wall before him. Below, the crowd still gathered outside the store even as the air turned crisp with the coming winter. The handmade signs were still held high by bare hands, not in protest, not in anger, but in quiet defense of something they believed to be right. Since the day Ruby posted the video, everything around him had begun to shift. The press had arrived in waves. News channels played on repeat the image of Zoey cradling a bowl of soup in a small diner, the haunted look in her eyes as she was led away, and the voice of a silver-haired waitress speaking softly of unconditional love. But what struck Benjamin the most wasn't the public support. It was what he felt happening inside himself. The things that had once ruled his days, his reputation, stock value, boardroom decisions now seemed strangely small. Candace had called multiple times, leaving long messages about how the company's image was being swept into a storm beyond control. She warned that he was damaging both the brand and investor trust. One message read, "That girl doesn't belong in your world. There are other ways to do good. Don't let emotion destroy everything you've built." Benjamin read that message once, then deleted it. He thought of Zoe's voice the first night they met. "I don't want to owe anyone. If I pay, then I deserve love." That sentence still echoed in his ears every time he looked at her photo, the one he kept quietly on his phone. Just one photo, never shared with anyone. Zoey at the window, drawing intently at the little wooden table, sunlight pouring through her tangled hair, her quiet eyes lit from within. A reporter called the next morning, offering an exclusive interview about Zoey's story. They said it could be a chance to clear up the confusion, to reshape his public image in the middle of a crisis. Benjamin declined. Not because he was afraid, but because he refused to turn a child's pain into a platform. He knew deep down that he hadn't rescued anyone. He was simply holding on to something the world had almost ignored. One late evening, as he was leaving the office, he passed by the windows of Cardier Kids. That place had once been his dream. His proof of success, the space where people lined up to touch something beautiful, something expensive. But now, looking through the glass, all he saw was Zoey in his memory. A worn-out pair of shoes, messy hair, eyes that had stopped believing in miracles. He had once designed toys to make children smile, but he had never truly understood that no toy, no matter how perfect, could warm a heart like the simple presence of someone who stays. An employee approached quietly, reminding him of a legal meeting scheduled for the next morning. Benjamin raised his hand gently, signaling not to interrupt. He was still staring into the space beyond the glass, and then he whispered almost to himself. "She isn't polished, she isn't perfect, she isn't clean, she isn't easy to love, but she's mine. Not because of blood, not because of duty, but because he chose her. A father doesn't need to be admired. He only needs to be trusted by the child who calls him her own." And Benjamin knew at the very moment he chose to stand with Zoey, he also gave up the right to be the man who gets applauded. He became something far more meaningful. He became a father, not by birth, but by choice. And that one choice would always be the greatest pride of his life. Weeks turned into months, but Benjamin never stopped fighting. The days of winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, and through every legal hurdle, every delay, and every interview with social workers, he remained steadfast. That morning, the sky was gray and still, as if the entire city were holding its breath, waiting for something quietly momentous to happen. Benjamin stepped out of the car in a plain gray suit, simpler than what he usually wore. No lapel pins, no entourage, no camera crews flanking his path, just him, Marcus, his most trusted attorney, and a quiet hope pulsing steadily in his chest. Outside the courthouse, a few people remained standing with signs that had faded from last night's rain. The letters were smudged, but the messages were clear. "Bring Zoey home. Children need love, not paperwork." He didn't speak to them, just gave a gentle nod. Words of gratitude would never be enough. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thick. Everyone present seemed to know this wasn't a typical custody hearing. The gallery was filled with unfamiliar faces, but in their eyes, expectation, hope. Ruby sat near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. A few Cartier Kids employees were there too. Even strangers who had only seen Zoey once on a rainy night at a diner had come, each person drawn by something private and quietly urgent. Benjamin sat in the front row, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the door Zoey would come through. And when that door finally opened, it was as though time slowed like an old film reel unspooling. Zoey entered in a simple knit dress holding a small stuffed animal, not an expensive toy, just the one thing she'd been allowed to keep from the shelter. Her hair was tied back though, still slightly messy, and when her eyes scanned the room and found Benjamin's, everyone held their breath. She dropped the toy, ran, across the room, past the protocol, beyond the rules. No one stopped her. Benjamin dropped to one knee, arms open wide, catching her as she threw herself into his chest. She clung to him fiercely, as if letting go might cause everything to disappear again, and in the hush of the room, her voice came out small but clear. I waited. Benjamin held her tighter, whispering just loud enough for her to hear Daddy's here. The room fell into a strange, sacred silence, not because of sentiment alone, but because everyone could see the truth laid bare. This was not a billionaire trying to prove goodness. This was a father trying to hold on to a child he hadn't fathered, but had come to love with the full weight of his heart. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes and a commanding presence, asked for order. She glanced at Zoey, then Benjamin, her expression unreadable. Her voice remained firm. Let's begin. Marcus presented the case: legal documentation, psychological evaluations, proof of financial and emotional readiness, a stable home environment, and most importantly, the evidence of deep emotional connection. Every word was deliberate, every point covered, but the most powerful arguments didn't come from the files. They came from how Zoey looked at Benjamin, how she wouldn't let go of his hand. Not even for a moment. A young psychologist testified next, describing her sessions with Zoey. She spoke of a bond that could not be manufactured, something real, something rooted not in gratitude, but trust. A child who had known loss and had finally found a place to be still. A child who now felt safe and seen and strong enough to speak. Others followed Ruby, a Cardier employee, a neighbor from Benjamin's building. Each voice shared small moments, but they all echoed the same truth. Zoey hadn't been saved, she had been loved. When it was Benjamin's turn, he didn't read from any prepared statement. He stood, met the judge's gaze, and spoke quietly, steadily. I'm not here to ask for a role in Zoey's life, he said. I'm here because she already gave me that role a long time ago. I'm not her biological father. But I was there when she had no one. I didn't plan for this, but my heart chose, and I stayed. Because a child shouldn't have to buy love, or beg for someone to stay. No one objected. No rebuttal came. His words didn't need to be defended. They simply were. The judge nodded, then closed the file before her. Her voice slowed, softened just slightly. Based on the documentation, witness testimonies, and the clearly established emotional bond between the petitioner and the child, this court hereby grants the petition for adoption filed by Mr. Benjamin Carter. In an instant, Zoey burst into tears, clinging to him again. He held her, one arm wrapped around her back, the other gently cradling her head. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no cheers, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something broken is finally mended. A child had found someone who chose to stay. And a man who had built everything now held the one thing that made him whole. He had found home. 1 week after the trial, just as Benjamin was beginning to grow accustomed to hearing Zoey call him Dad on sunlit mornings, when the light spilled gently through the window, another handwritten letter arrived at Attorney Marcus's office. The envelope bore no return address, only a name written in slanted cursive with faint violet ink in the top left corner, Lauren. After reading it, Marcus immediately called Benjamin and told him he ought to meet the woman. They arranged to meet at a small cafe by the riverside, a quiet place far from the eyes of the public. When Benjamin stepped inside, he recognized her instantly, though they had never met. She was thin, delicate, with long black hair falling softly past her shoulders. Her eyes were tired but clear, like someone who had learned how to endure without needing to ask why. She stood as he approached, didn't offer a handshake, only bowed her head slightly. Benjamin returned the nod and took a seat. The first few minutes passed in silence. Then Lauren spoke, her voice low and hoarse. I'm Zoey's mother. He nodded. I know. She reached into her bag and placed an old photograph on the table. Zoey, around 4 years old, riding on her mother's shoulders, laughing beneath a canopy of cherry blossoms. She used to be so happy. Benjamin looked at the picture, a strange, unnamed feeling rising in his chest. Her voice steadied as she continued. I used to work the night shift at a hotel reception desk. Raised her on my own. No family, no friends. One night on my way home, I was hit by a car. I was in a coma for 3 months. When I woke up, Zoey was gone. No one knew where she had gone. No one kept any record of me. I lost everything. Benjamin's hand clenched slightly. You don't blame anyone? Lauren looked straight at him. I do. Of course I do. I blame myself for not being strong enough to protect her. I blame the world for not leaving me even a trace to follow. But then I saw the news about you, the trial, the video. I watched the way she looked at you. She paused, her eyes starting to glisten. I didn't come here to take her back. My health is still fragile, and I have nothing left to offer her but my love. I cannot drag her back into a life of uncertainty. I came to say thank you. The words hit Benjamin with a disbelief that made his breath catch. He looked up into her eyes. The woman sitting across from him was not someone broken. She was a mother who had traveled through the deepest chambers of despair, and instead of letting bitterness lead the way, she chose love. She went on. I've asked myself 100 times whether I could have given Zoey a better life, whether I even had the right to return after vanishing like a ghost. But when I saw the way she looked at you like you were home, I knew I hadn't lost her. She had been found. Benjamin couldn't speak. His throat closed. He had never prepared for a moment like this. Never imagined sitting across from Zoey's birth mother. But Lauren asked for nothing. She simply said softly, I just want to know she's safe. If possible, maybe sometimes I could send a letter, maybe a drawing. I don't need to meet her, just so she knows her mother is still somewhere out there. Not because she left, but because it was too late to come back. Benjamin nodded. Speaking for the first time since sitting down, you can send them. Anytime, and when Zoey is ready, you can meet her. Lauren gave a faint smile, one that carried sorrow and peace all at once. She stood and took a handkerchief from her bag embroidered with the image of a small bird and the slanted words, Be brave, little bird. I stitched this before Zoey disappeared. She used to call herself the little bird. I hope that little bird has found her nest now. Then she turned and walked away. She did not cry. She did not look back. She left only a deep silence, the kind that follows a quiet act of grace. A mother who did not return to reclaim, but to give one last time her faith that her daughter had found a love that was true. That afternoon, Benjamin picked Zoey up from school just like any other day. In the car, she chatted cheerfully about her art class, about the picture of a flying elephant she was in the middle of coloring, then suddenly asked a question that made him glance at her through the rearview mirror. Uncle Ben, someone sent me a handkerchief with a little bird embroidered on it. Who was it? Benjamin didn't answer right away. He slowly pulled the car over to the side of the road, turned to look at Zoey, her eyes still full of innocence, but now carrying a quiet expectation. He reached into his pocket, carefully unfolded the handkerchief, and placed it in her small hands. It was your mother. Zoey stared intently at the stitching. Her tiny hand trembled ever so slightly. She didn't ask why her mother had left. Didn't ask why she had only come back now. She simply sat in silence, then after a long while whispered, She still remembers me. Benjamin nodded. Always has. Zoey clutched the handkerchief tightly, then suddenly asked, So, if Mom comes back, do I still get to keep you? The question cut gently but deeply through Benjamin's heart. He took her other hand and said softly, You don't have to choose, sweet girl, because we've already chosen you. 1 week later, they met Lauren again in a park on the southern edge of the city. It was the first time Zoey had seen her mother in many years. There were no tears, no running into each other's arms like in the movies, just a long, steady gaze, then a single slow step forward. Zoey walked up and handed Lauren the embroidered handkerchief. She said, I held on to this for you. Now I'm giving it back. Lauren took it. Lips pressed tight, eyes red with emotion. She knelt down to be level with Zoey, as though handling a fragile memory. You've grown so much. Zoey nodded, then turned to Benjamin and took his hand. The other still rested in her mother's. The three of them stood there hand in hand. No one said a word, but something in the air seemed warmer in the soft afternoon light. Passers-by paused, looking on, not knowing why the moment tugged gently at their hearts. Zoey turned to her mother and asked in a whisper, Are you still sad? Lauren shook her head, smiling gently. No, because now I know you're being loved the way you deserve. She stroked her daughter's hair. And if you want, I'll always be here. I won't step in. I just want you to know I never forgot you. Zoey looked at them both, then suddenly gripped their hands tighter in her own. I don't want to be split anymore. If I can, I want to keep you both. Benjamin bowed his head, unable to hold back his tears. He said softly, Then from now on, we're a family. We don't have to be the same. We don't have to be perfect, we just have to have each other. Lauren nodded. Family is where no one gets left behind. And that afternoon, as the last light of day fell upon the three figures sitting on a park bench, golden leaves drifting quietly around them, time seemed to pause to make space for something simple and precious. The moment a child was no longer torn between the past and the future because both had taken her hand and chosen to stay. That evening, as Benjamin's car turned onto the familiar road leading to the tall building where he lived, Zoey rested her head against the window, still clutching the little embroidered handkerchief with the tiny bird in her hand. The sky had deepened into a rich purple, and the city lights reflected gently on her small face, calm and quiet. Since the meeting with her mother in the park, Zoey hadn't said much, but her silence no longer felt heavy. It was like a soft blanket laid over a heart that had stopped aching. When they stepped into the apartment, Zoey took off her shoes slowly, then looked around the space. She didn't run to her art corner as she usually did, didn't ask if the warm milk was ready. Instead, she walked to the sofa where she had slept the very first night she stayed over, sat down quietly, and gazed up at the ceiling. Benjamin set the bags down and sat beside her. How does this place feel to you now? Zoey tilted her head, thought for a moment, then said, It used to be too big, too cold, like a museum, but not anymore. Benjamin smiled. What does it feel like now? Like somewhere someone's waiting for me to come home, whether I'm late or early, whether I'm happy or sad. Her words left him still. For so many years, this apartment had been everything he thought he needed. It was spacious, filled with light, furnished with elegance, lined with expensive paintings. But it had never truly been a home. Not until a child walked in, left muddy shoes by the door, and hung a scribbled painting on the fridge. From that day, everything changed. Benjamin stood up and walked to the kitchen. He returned with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, calling out Zoey. Come here. She ran over, her eyes lighting up at the sight of whipped cream on top. He sat down at the dining table, the one that had once stood mostly unused, now transformed into the place where they shared everything. Did anyone at school make you sad today? Benjamin asked. No, but someone asked why I don't look like my dad, and what did you say? I said it's because I was chosen, not born. Her answer caught him so off guard he forgot to breathe for a moment. Zoey kept stirring her cocoa, smiling softly. I think being chosen is kind of nice, like when you're lost in a store and someone decides to take you home, keep you, and never give you back. Benjamin leaned down, placing his hand gently over hers. And I will never give you back, even if you spill milk draw on the walls or turn this place into a zoo. Zoey laughed, her laughter filling the apartment like sunlight. It was no longer unfamiliar, but it still moved him every time. After dinner, he let her choose the bedtime story. She picked an old book with a worn cover. He had barely read a few lines when Zoey sat up, pulled the blanket over her legs, and said quietly, You know what I like this home now? Because it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to have room for me. Benjamin paused, looking at her for a long time. She didn't need a castle or a princess room or a room full of toys. All she needed was someone waiting for her return, someone to hold her when she was cold, someone to listen when she was sad. It was the kind of thing he had never believed existed in his world. And now it was here in the form of a child sitting beside him in the quiet of a winter night. That night when he turned off the light, Zoey was already asleep, curled up with her old stuffed animal. Benjamin stood at her door, watching, feeling something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Not a career, not wealth, but a true home. And now he had it. In the warm silence and the steady breath of a child he had chosen to love for the rest of his life. Several months later, Benjamin's apartment was no longer the quiet, orderly space it had once been, the kind of place where a man lived alone. Now each day began with the soft slap of tiny slippers on the floor, the faint smell of burnt toast from Zoey's experiments with the toaster, and a trail of crayon drawings scattered from the dining table to the living room floor. One morning, as Benjamin was crouched down, collecting markers that had rolled beneath a chair, Zoey came running over, holding a painting that was nearly twice the size of her small face. In the picture were 2 figures holding an umbrella over a child standing in the rain. Next to them, in a wobbly, handwritten line, were the words, "Everyone deserves to stay." Benjamin sat down and took the painting from her gently. Zoey looked at him with a serious expression. "Uncle Ben, how many kids out there don't have someone to choose them like I did?" Her question stopped him cold. He had read the statistics. He had donated to shelters and charities. He had written large checks with generous intentions. But he had never sat across from such a question delivered so plainly, so quietly. After a moment, he answered, "More than we think." Zoey nodded, then placed her small hand over his. "Then, let's help them." From that moment, an idea began to form. Not a campaign, not a public relations effort, but something more rooted, something real. A way to connect hearts that had once been left behind with those who had the courage to stay. Benjamin called it the Zoey Hope Foundation. They began with a small office tucked behind the Cardier Kids store in what used to be a stockroom. Ruby came to help with the paperwork. A few of Benjamin's former staff volunteered their time. Whiteboards went up on the walls. Names of shelters and youth programs were listed. Small maps marked regions most in need of support. But what surprised everyone wasn't how Benjamin led the project. It was the presence of his young co-founder, who arrived each afternoon with a paper bag filled with colored pencils and watercolor sets. Zoey made a drawing for every child they tried to help. Each piece had a name on it, a house, a pair of shoes, or simply a hug sketched in color. She wrote a note on the back of each one, like a message to a friend she hadn't met yet. "I hope you had breakfast today. I wish I could hug you." Benjamin watched those drawings line the walls one by one and understood perhaps more deeply than ever before that love wasn't made of grand gestures. It was made of small acts repeated with care and sincerity. Soon the media began to take notice, not because of who Benjamin was, but because of a little girl who once asked the cost of a mother and was now using her drawings to give love back to others like her. Schools began requesting to display Zoey's artwork. Small exhibitions were held where entry wasn't charged by ticket, but by bringing a pair of gently used shoes to donate. At one such event, Zoey stood in the center wearing a blue dress that Lauren had sent her. Her hair braided her hands holding a messy painter's palette. When a reporter asked why she did all this, she replied, "Because I still remember what it feels like to be left behind. And because someone chose me, I want to choose other kids too." Her words began to spread across social media, not as a viral quote, but as a quiet reminder that there are wounds only healed by being shared. And Benjamin, standing just out of sight watching her smile, understood that the Zoey Hope Foundation hadn't only rescued homeless children. It had rescued him too. A man who once believed he had everything until he learned that a true home isn't built from square footage or fine furniture. It is made when someone needs you to be there, and you choose every day not to leave. That Saturday morning, the Cartier Kids store opened earlier than usual because Zoey wanted to display a new collection of drawings she had made for the winter fundraising program, all created for children she had never met but already cared about. Ruby had a pot of hot cocoa ready and had hung a small canvas near the entrance with a carefully handwritten message. A home doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs someone waiting. Zoey sat on the tall stool by the counter, humming softly as she taped up another drawing. Behind her, Benjamin was sorting through donation items sent in after last weekend's exhibit. Everything was unfolding as it always did, quiet, steady, warm, until the little bell above the glass door jingled. A boy, maybe 6 years old, stepped in. His hair was a tangled mass of curls. The shoulders of his sweater were frayed, and one leg of his jeans was damp from melted snow. He had come alone. In his hand, crumpled and clutched tightly, was a $1 bill. He walked straight up to the counter and stood in front of Zoey, his eyes stubborn but pleading. His voice was small but clear, so clear that the entire store fell into silence the moment he spoke. "Ma'am, I want to buy a mom who won't leave, a mom who hugs you when you sleep, a mom like in the pictures. Is $1 enough?" Zoey froze, her hand still holding the roll of tape mid-air. Ruby turned away, pressing her lips together to keep them from trembling, while Benjamin stepped out from the back, his eyes flickering between the present moment and something long buried in memory. No one said a word. The room seemed to stop breathing. Zoey stepped down from the stool and walked over to the boy. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice deeper than usual. The boy looked at her, his answer almost a whisper. "Will." She looked at the dollar in his hand, then knelt down to meet his eyes. "Well, you don't have to buy a mom. A mom isn't something you can buy, but you can find someone who will love you like a mom. And sometimes that doesn't start with money, it starts with believing." Will looked unsure, his small face still tight with confusion. Zoey smiled, gently reached into the drawer behind the counter and pulled out a small painting. In the drawing was a home with 2 open arms and a heart between them. She held it out to him. "I drew this when I thought no one wanted me. Now I'm giving it to you, because I believe you'll find where you belong." Will took the drawing, his hand trembling ever so slightly. Then, as if some quiet magic had happened, he nodded. He didn't ask more questions, didn't argue. He just pressed the drawing to his chest, turned, and walked toward the door. But before he left, he looked back and asked, "If I find a real mom, can I come back and tell you?" Zoe's smile trembled. Her eyes were rimmed with red. "I'll be here every Saturday morning. I'll be waiting." Ruby turned to wipe down the glass counter, but it was clear she was hiding eyes too full. Benjamin stood still, his hand over his chest, feeling his heart slow as if bearing witness to something sacred coming full circle. 10 months ago in this very spot, a little girl in a thin coat had walked in and asked to buy a mother. And today, that same girl gave a piece of hope to another child. Not with money, but with a story lived again, this time with a different ending. And in that moment, everyone present understood. What Zoe had once received was now quietly spreading outward, gently, steadily, without condition. Because when one child is loved the right way, the world begins to change for all the others too. Benjamin stood behind the counter of the Cardier Kids store, the same counter where he had once been a stranger, a man shaped by numbers, deadlines, and strategic meetings. But that man no longer existed. He was no longer just a figure of power and profit. He was a father, a man who had been redeemed by a child who once walked into his life with nothing but $18.75, asking to buy a mother. Now, as he looked at the painting Zoe had once made hanging on the wall, capturing her journey from a homeless child to a beacon of hope for countless others, he understood something that no amount of wealth or success had ever taught him. Love cannot be bought, but it can always be chosen. And it was that choice that saved both him and Zoe. Life, as we know, is never perfect. No one is born into love that's always enough. But the miracle lies in the fact that each of us, no matter our past, holds the power to choose to love, even when we've been hurt, even when we've been lost. Zoe was chosen, and then she chose others. That is the circle of hope, and that is what makes this life worth living. Dear viewers, we know this story may have caught your breath in more than one moment. Maybe you were once a Zoe, someone who felt they were unworthy of love. Or maybe you were a Benjamin, someone who believed success was everything, until you realized that the most important thing in life is simply having someone to come home to. So what about you? How did this story make you feel? Did it stir a memory or touch a part of your heart that you hadn't visited in a while? Is there someone in your life whom you once chose to stay for with no condition attached? We would love to hear from you, truly from the heart. Please feel free to share your story in the comments below. Whether it's long or short, you never know whose life your words might touch, whose pain they might gently soothe. If today's story meant something to you, we invite you to click like, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to Emotional Echoes to join us in discovering more heartfelt, meaningful stories every day. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you warm, positive, family-friendly content that resonates with all ages and uplifts the human spirit. Because love doesn't need grand gestures, it only needs the quiet choice to stay, to listen, and not to walk away. We hope that each of us can choose to love, perhaps starting with a hug, a glance, or a simple question that says, "I'm here." Wishing all of you watching this a life filled with health, joy, peace, and love that never asks to be earned, only chosen. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next video on Emotional Echoes.